Today, I bring on Lee to talk about Charted and their AP automation solution for NetSuite. And we talk about a few things that are really interesting, taking that vendor approval flow so that you can create vendors, also taking the vendor bills, automating that, extracting that invoices that you're getting from NetSuite. What is the ROI and when does it make sense to actually use an automation solution? We go into specific numbers here. And we also talk about accruals, how to do month end closing faster, and then finally, different ways to do approval automations for purchase recs and purchase orders. So stay tuned because you will love this if you are in an AP department. Lee, I wanted to talk a little bit more about AP automation, make sure I understand what all NetSuite can do. And I'm familiar with Charted and a little bit more about the product, but there are areas that I think I could still learn a lot more about and all the functionality that has been developed over the years because I've seen it in many iterations over many years. And it's come a really long way and is one of my go to products to refer people to for AP automation. But can you start by just giving me a rough understanding of what is AP automation so that people can know, like, what is that topic? What does it kind of cover within the NetSuite ecosystem?
Yeah, sure. And so when we're thinking about AP automation, we're looking at kind of the legacy historical accounts payable process and the way things have worked in the back office for the past 30, 40 years, where the real innovation that existed prior to the past few years was just being able to copy and paste information out of PDFs. So a lot of businesses, when they consider their AP process, it is a lot of humans sitting there taking invoices, copying and pasting information into NetSuite or into QuickBooks or whatever ERP they're using. And then some manual processes for approvals, generating ACH Nacha files to upload to their bank, printing checks and stuffing them in envelopes. That's like the baseline for a lot of organizations. And up until a few years ago, it was really just like kind of the industry standard with like very little automation. The revolution that's really taking place over the past few years is like adding automation intelligence into those workflows so that now, rather than humans performing the repetitive mundane processes, we can automate the simple things. So using AI to extract data off of invoices and map that directly into NetSuite, using integrations into the banking network so we can automatically pull funds out of an account and push those directly to a vendor's account. So eliminating the whole check process or the kind of the risk of the notch file upload. So we look at each step of that process along the way from like the time you start a relationship with a vendor to the time you're settling payments with them. And we think, how can we use the technology available to us to make that process more seamless so that the humans can just operate more strategically and manage by exception rather than having to perform like each individual task.
That makes sense a lot. And so let's take a baseline of what the native NetSuite processes are out of the box without any add on modules. If we take a look at that, then we know that you can create a vendor record, you can create a PO for that vendor, you can manually create a vendor bill for when you receive an invoice from that vendor. But at the moment, these are all impacting the GL within NetSuite and it's great for being able to have a full transactions that procure to pay process for these vendors. But AP automation will take it another layer because at the moment, natively out of the box, what you're doing is you're creating the vendor record manually, maybe creating the PO manually or directly off of some type of MRP requirements if you're in like the manufacturing space, or maybe a drop ship scenario where you're automatically creating the PO off of a sales order if it's a dropship item. But you've got some lightweight automations to tell you what you should purchase, but then you're sending that PO, you're receiving goods into your warehouse as like a item receipt. So you're receiving that in. And then at that point, you're also getting the invoice from that vendor. And each of these steps, you're from, especially from the invoice from the vendor, you're manually having to create the vendor bill to key in everything manually inside of NetSuite so that you can reconcile and say, all right, this is the invoice I received from the vendor, which matches what I actually received, which matches what was on the PO in the first place. And after we've got all of that, we know end to end, we're good to go. So that's really the native processes. And as many people can tell, those are manually keying in. Now, if you've got just, you know, 20 invoices from vendors a month, it's probably pretty manageable. But there's different layers on top of that where let's say I've got 1,000 invoices a month, that would be not sustainable to have a human be entering those vendor bills in and then tying them out and matching them against what you actually received to verify what that vendor's invoice is actually accurate. Otherwise, you'd want to not pay for something you didn't receive. And then that it also matches the PO in the first place. So that's the native process. How does AP automation take this to another level? I know you alluded to it on receiving of that invoice from the vendors, but explain what that means a little bit more when you're using AI to extract that information.
Yeah. Yeah. So that is a really common question we get is kind of what's different between charted solution and just NetSuite out of the box, which can be like a little difficult or confusing to explain because like our solution is so like deeply embedded within NetSuite. Like sometimes people even don't realize what is and is not our product. So like taking just a few examples of what you just walked through the process, think of the vendor onboarding flow. So typically the way it would work, if you're using just kind of NetSuite out of the box, you're going to email a vendor, someone from the AP teams emailing the vendor, asking for their W-9, asking them to provide, maybe you have a form that they fill out, with all of their tax and address and bank account information. And that's all being collected manually via email, then usually pasted into NetSuite. So as you're creating and updating that vendor record, what we do from the automation perspective, so natively within NetSuite, you create a new vendor, so you give it, give them a name, and then we have a form that can be sent out, and that form can be fully customized to collect their addresses, their W-9, all of their different forms, their bank account information, and then all that data can be securely captured and pushed directly back into NetSuite. So rather than having somebody managing the back and forth via email and the copying and pasting in NetSuite and taking on the risk that they're going to fat finger something or they're going to miss something, now you can kind of dynamically capture all of the data that you absolutely need. And then we just put an approval record on that saying, hey, this is what we've received from the update from the vendor. These are the fields that have been updated and changed. Do you approve these changes? So automating was previously a very manual back and forth and very error prone process that can now be captured directly in NetSuite. So you take kind of the human element out of that.
Let me
The
restate that for a moment though, because I we'll go through the rest of these automations, but I want to take them one piece at a time and then just restate what I think I heard. So normally I would have to click save and create of the vendor, but what you're saying is you enter the vendor name and maybe like the vendor email. You click save the very first time you're creating it. It sends an email out to that person with maybe a link within that email to fill out a form. And when they're filling out that form data is integrated to NetSuite. So when that vendor clicks submit, it's going to that vendor record that has been created and attaching the attachment to the W-9, inputting their company name or like their address and other additional information. And I'm assuming it's a customized form, whatever you need to actually capture, depending on your industry. And so then after they've submitted, then all you have to do is say approve, I've received everything. So you've got the admin on the procurement team is initiating the creation and then approving it. They're not needing to do anything in between, which can be a lot of emails back and forth over and over again. So that's the first part of AP automation is just the setup of the vendor record, your creation and approve. Everything in between, Charted handles between that.
Correct. Yeah, that's exactly it. And maybe I'll share my screen here and I can give you just the most like simplistic example of this. I'm just going to walk you through the flow for updating bank account information for a vendor. So this is one of the most common ones and also one of the most risky scenarios we see where bank account information can easily be, um, fraudulently submitted by a third party or fat fingered or, different errors that could come into play as you're collecting the information. So we just send out, rather than accepting a bank account via email, we send out this form. The vendor's going to have to use multi-factor authentication to actually submit this form. We have the vendor receives this payment method update, and then the vendor's going to add their information. I'll just do my personal to make this quick.
You've gone through, submitted the updated payment information.
Correct. Yeah. And so we're able to capture the vendor's bank account information based on what country they're in, we're able to update that so that we have all the required fields to actually process that vendor's payments.
And now that that has been updated, that information actually is in NetSuite at that very moment. Is that
Correct.
right?
Yep. Yeah. So as soon as it's
Okay.
updated, it's pulled back into NetSuite, and then there is an approval based for the person who submitted it or whoever your approver in the organization is to go in and approve that bank account information for payment.
Okay, that makes sense. And then it's in a dashboard for any approval for that accounts payable person to review that updated payment.
Yep. Yeah. So I can show you that dashboard too if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be
Um,
neat.
yeah. So here you see we have our payment methods to approve dashboard, and I've got 5 different payment methods here in my account. I'm just going to open up one of them, and this one was requesting a check, but you see I've got their mailing address here and all the information from the vendor. And as I go through, you can see the email that was sent to versus what was requested. And if I'm willing to accept this change in the email, for instance, or any of this other information, I just go in as the admin and I approve this record.
So we're all within NetSuite, and that's where all the approvals flow. That's amazing.
Perfect. Yep.
So we've talked about the automation of the vendor. That's one of the pieces. And then we've got some other automations that will likely occur. Tell me a little bit about some of the most common automations beyond that, or pick one other one, then we'll walk through.
Yeah, so the biggest one, like in our real killer app that like most of our customers are really dying to use is our Invoice AI. And so that is taking invoices that you receive from your vendors and capturing those directly in NetSuite and creating vendor bills based off of the data that can just be extracted using OCR and then intelligently mapping that data um, either based on information we've extracted from a purchase order that already matches in your system, or we're also looking at your historical invoices. So if you've had an invoice that came from that same vendor, we're going to look at any changes you made previously, any coding you did to that invoice previously, and we're automatically going to suggest that so that at least like 70% of the time, the invoice is going to be completely coded, and you're just going to have to click save to submit that invoice for approval.
Yeah, that makes sense. So at the point of creation and receiving an invoice, you typically would get this via email. Then I'd have to just manually create the vendor bill in NetSuite, add all the lines, all the details from that. I mean, that might take 10 minutes per invoice, call it. And then save it and then move on to the next one, plus the distraction time that an employee has to be able to enter in that data. So what you're saying is you receive an invoice via email, and then all that information, whether it's from the body of the email or an attachment, like a PDF attachment, gets extracted and mapped so that the vendor bill can get created in like a draft format so that it can then be approved, that it actually extracted it out correctly. And that way you're just doing some like final check over if, and maybe just for ones that get flagged as there's a certain degree of certainty, whether you have extracted all of the information or not, and it can flag ones where it's like, I'm not sure, I'm taking a stab at it. And then those ones you probably definitely want to review for final approval. Explain what that like flagging, does it auto approve it if it's over X degree of certainty? How does that work?
Yeah, well, that's a cool question because that's something we actually recently released was our touchless invoice processing solution. And with that, we can take an invoice from sitting in your inbox to submitted for approval without any human ever touching it. Now, obviously, there are a lot of criteria we want to look at to make sure we have confidence that invoice is actually going to be correctly coded. So there's a couple of different ways we go about this. One is if it's a PO-backed invoice and it matches the PO, exactly within your tolerances anyway, we can submit that just to go through the happy path so the AP organization never has to touch those. That's a pretty high volume. We've seen close to about 3% of all invoices going through our Invoice AI solution being processed touchlessly just off of POs alone. The other piece of the solution that we released was vendor-specific touchless invoicing. So we know that a lot of our customers receive invoices that every month that they never touch. Think of like utility bills, for instance, where they're pretty simple. Our Invoice AI learns it very quickly and easily, and they have a high degree of confidence. Those can also be set up for those specific vendors to go through the happy path, so the AP team never has to touch those as well. And then they just hit your approval workflows. So if it's above a certain dollar value, or maybe anything that was processed touchlessly, is always going to go for an approval before it's actually hits the GL. But that's saving a large amount of time for some of our customers. Like we've seen some of our customers over 25% adoption of touchless invoicing since we just released it in, I think it was in October, about 2 months, less than 2 months ago.
Oh, that's amazing. That's really neat to be able to have that. I can see in high volume scenarios that takes it to a whole new level of savings. It makes a lot of sense. Now,
Mm.
I have a question that I'm not really sure what the answer is because I don't know at what point do I say that you should definitely get a more of an AI where it's extracting the vendor bills. How many invoices a month that if I'm entering in a certain number of vendor bills into NetSuite manually today, at what point does it make it worthwhile to really go in more automated? Like there's got to be a certain threshold number that makes a lot of sense. And somewhere it's like, it's just barely means that you might start looking at it, especially if your volume's about to increase, just to prepare for it. Like what is that scenario?
Yeah, it really depends on the business. Typically I would say like once you have a full-time person doing this AP job, like that is definitely time that you should begin automating. Um, some smaller businesses or businesses that are preparing for scale, so think of like pre-revenue biotech or like, private equity backed or growth equity backed software companies who are expecting quite a bit of growth. Like they will typically adopt automation a little bit earlier, as they'll also typically adopt NetSuite a little bit earlier, because they're like preparing for that growth and they may not have the revenue, but they have the spend. But once you have like that full-time employee focused on accounts payable, once you have a controller in the organization, those are kind of the flags we look for. Small businesses, who are starting with, 15, 20, 30 invoices per month, probably not worth the investment to actually automate the process because you typically just have one person inputting, approving, and paying all your bills anyway. But as soon as that organization scales into multiple people, that's usually when we see like the investment in the software start to pay off.
Yeah, let me do some quick napkin math on my phone here. I'm just going to draw some quick assumptions to decide on how to make some ROI. And let me just think through it. So let's say that it takes on average 10 minutes to do a vendor bill. Is that fair?
Yeah, yeah, 10 minutes is
Yeah,
pretty good.
just roughly. That means you got 6 an hour times, we'll call it 7 hours a day because you probably have team meetings or miscellaneous meetings, and that um, times that by like 20 working days, let's say. That's 840 invoices a month is roughly that you're processing as a full-time employee. And let's actually just divide that by 2 for a moment. So divide by 2, we're at like 420, but we'll say 400 just to keep it clean. And then at 400 invoices, probably starts to definitely make sense around that level. Let's take an AP. This is an admin type of role. Um, they're probably making 50,000 a year, roughly that. So let's take 50,000, but we have to calculate the cost of business, which is normally going to be about 1.4 that. So that would be after taxes and things like that. So 70,000 a year cost of business for an AP person to do roughly 800 invoices a month. So I remember I said divide by 2. So the value 35,000 a year recurring is the value of doing 400, roughly
Mm.
400 invoices a month. So that's pretty interesting. I think when people think about how much they're actually paying in labor, that to process 400 invoices a month manually as someone making 50K a year, that means that um, that cost of business is roughly 35K.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
interesting.
and actually, yeah. Well, so I could have stopped you. I actually have an ROI calculator. I'm trying to plug
Oh,
in
okay.
the
Well, I just did the quick napkin math.
yeah, but you're pretty close. Hang on, I'll share the screen here too. Yeah, so you said 400 invoices a month, so that's 4,800 invoices per year. And then usually we assume they're aggregating some of those invoices down into like multiple invoices in one payment. So let's say they're doing like 3,000 payments per year and like a 50-50 split between check and ACH, which is pretty typical. So what we look at in the ROI calculator here is first the cost of doing things manually. So according to a report from Ardent Partners, it's their Metrics That Matter report in 2024. They measure like the fully burdened cost, what you just calculated, like labor, overhead, software licenses, paper, envelopes, those types of things. And the fully burdened cost per invoice that's processed for an average organization is $9.87.
Hold on.
Then we look,
Let's do some quick math real quick. I said 70K divided by 840. No, um, that was 840 a month. So one second. I'm just gonna verify this. Don't tell me yet. One sec. So that's 10,000. So I'm calculating 70,000 divided by 10,000, right? And that's $7. I calculated seven.
nice.
Hey, I'll take that as a win
We're
for
pretty close. Yeah. Yeah. If we're within a factor of like 50%, that is a win. Uh, all right. So so we'll take 987 for the sake of this math. ACH fairly cheap to process because they can be done in pretty large bulk batches. Checks very expensive. So we look at this report from the AFP in 2022. They said anywhere between $4 and $20 per check, and that's taking into account like how much manual labor someone has to do, like
It's a
sitting there and stuffing
surprisingly
checks and
high
envelopes.
amount
Yeah,
because again, if you have a check, if you're dealing with checks to pay, you gotta go through that process to print it, to mail it. That's
yeah,
labor. People are touching that.
yeah. And
It's
if
real
if
labor,
it's
and real labor is way more expensive than people often realize how much they're spending on that type of labor.
Yeah, yeah, it truly is. Especially if you consider like, well, now you have to have somebody in an office like sitting next to a printer and just sitting there stuffing envelopes versus something that could be completely outsourced to a print center, right? So like, there's a significant cost for that office, that desk, that printer, so on. But let's just take the conservative estimate, right? $4 per check, and then we calculate all of this out: 4,800 invoices, 3,000 payments, for a total annual cost of $54,000. Right, so this is a pretty modest sized organization. So we look at like what our subscription would cost. So for our largest package, we're looking at subscription, number of scans, and then your efficiency gain. We expect there's still some manual labor left, right? So we take a
You got
70%
approvals,
efficiency gain.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah, you
exactly.
still have to
Yeah,
approve and review if the outliers.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, like there's always going to be exceptions in the queue to spend time on, but now they're only spending time on exceptions versus like the mundane repetitive. You take the net there, $35,000. So for a modest sized organization, less than 5,000 invoices per year, they're saving eighteen thousand
Wait, so you just
dollars bottom line.
calculated the total annual cost at how many? 400
So,
at
so this
400
is
a
yeah,
month,
yeah, 400 invoices per month, 4,800 invoices per year.
and your
Just
cost was 35K?
yep,
Hey, that is pretty spot on.
yeah, yeah. I know. We're actually like your math was
I
very
was looking for
solid.
200, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I mean, looking at the bottom line, like this is like I said, pretty modest sized organization. Like this is really where you'd start to see AP automation, but particularly if you're planning to grow, right? Like if this organization thinks they're going to scale to 10,000 invoices, oops, sorry, and 7,000 payments, right?
Yeah, it
Then
just keeps
this
on going
becomes
up where
a
your
full-time
savings
employee.
go up, your total labor burden goes down quite a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And so like particularly as they're preparing for growth, like this is where we'll see kind of the earlier stage companies come in, at that 4,800 invoices per month, because a few years from now, when they are at the 10,000 mark, this is going to prevent them from having to hire a second AP employee.
So what I'm seeing is that right at 200 invoices a month, it's probably break even. It's
Yeah.
worthwhile if you think you're going to continue to grow,
Hmm.
or if you don't want to deal with the turnover costs of someone doing this and training costs, and you just want to automate it, make it easier now. But I'm guessing people don't think of it as a main pain point because if it's just break even, it's just barely a pain point at that point. It's probably break even at 200 invoices a month, meaning that probably worthwhile to implement if you plan to have any type of growth beyond that.
Yeah,
Because it does two things. I think making the change when it flips the ROI is just right there, and it maybe doesn't seem to make any money at the really move the needle. It can still make sense to switch over at that point if you plan to grow anytime in the near future, or how reliable is that employee as a long term employee? Are you doing any legacy planning? Because the moment that you have to start training, the ROI increases at that hump over that 200 mark. So because you're taking leadership time and training time, that's additional cost beyond the 50K of that salary for that AP person. Or if you're paying that person more than 50K a year, then all of those would be factors that the 200 a month is there begins to be ROI. So I would say based on that math that we just saw, if you're doing more than 200 vendor in, vendor bills a month, then at that stage, Charted is a great solution to just be switching to.
yeah, it's a solid recommendation. And I really like all the like alternative factors you pulled in there as well. Like one of the ones that we hear a lot of is turnover within accounts payable.
It's
I
high.
mean, you can think of
It's
yeah,
quite high,
any
actually.
any mundane job where there's like a lot of repetitive work, like people aren't going to stick around very long for that. And so the more you can make the work a little more interesting and automate the mundane, like the less often you're going to have to replace that AP person in your organization as well, which is extremely costly and burdensome. And then your CFO is the one coding invoices until he's able to hire somebody new.
Yeah, and then so not only are you paying where your math was you gotta train someone new, but when that person leaves, you're right, it's usually your more expensive employee who's making 80 or 90 or more a year, and so that doubles your costs, your burden to the business, and they're not doing more value added things on top of that, so that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
What other types of, automation yeah, I know we talked about the vendor creation and we talked about the extracting the vendor bill. Are those the main two components, or are there other components that you can think of within the AP automation side of things?
Yeah, no, there are quite a few. One of the other ones we tackle is accrual automation. So, this is a big piece of a lot of organizations, especially the more sophisticated organizations, month-end close, and it's the AP team who's usually looking to book the accruals at the end of the month. And so we're looking at data on unbilled purchase orders. We're looking at, or sorry, open purchase orders. We're looking at historical expenses per vendor so that we can forecast what your accrual month-end accruals should be. So, let's say like you normally have $200,000 in legal expenses every month, but you've only been billed for 50K this month. We see historically the past 3 months, what your rate has been, and we can predict what this month should be. So that rather than the AP team having to go to each individual stakeholder across the organization and ask like, did you have any hours from legal this month that you haven't received the bill for, or reaching out to those vendors themselves asking what the unbilled amounts are? We can use our solution to automate that process and speed up the month end close.
Okay. So what do you mean by automate what process there?
Yep. So automating the entry of the month end accruals. So typically the way it's going to work is someone from AP is going to have a spreadsheet. They'll export all of their vendors that they usually work with, and they know they often have accrued expenses. And then they're either going to go manually look at their POs or reach out to a department head to ask specifically, like, have you worked with legal this month? And should we have been billed for hours that we haven't been billed for? And then they're going to enter that information, whatever they estimate the expense should be, in the Excel spreadsheet. They'll finish doing their calculations, and then they'll upload this back into NetSuite. So rather than doing that, we take the data out of NetSuite, create the table in NetSuite, and then allow them to make any adjustments they want in the worksheet before automatically creating the journal entry for them.
I got it. So they're doing this because they don't yet have the invoices, but they still want to close out the month. And then do they go back up and update that later based on actuals?
So they'll make a journal reversal afterwards. So once
Okay.
the actuals come in, that journal reversal will be
Is that
automatically entered.
part being automated when you receive the actual vendor bill?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So
Okay.
yeah, and that's all. The beautiful thing is like it's all happening natively within NetSuite too. So it's not any outside system where your auditor doesn't have transparency into what has happened, why you calculated the accrual. It's all happening in your native NetSuite environment. So we're able to capture any notes, any adjustments, and then obviously the actual journal entry and the reversal of that journal, all within NetSuite. So it's easily audited and consolidated in one place.
That's a huge value add because it's not only just the trying to figure out what these expenses should be that they're trying to compare, but also once you do get the actuals, going back to create those journal entries and tie them all out after the fact so that you can actually close your month and move on, rather than waiting for all these invoices from all your vendors to come in. Makes a lot of sense. Is there any other automations that jump out at you that are useful that we talk about?
Yeah, no, we can talk about this all day if you want. Uh, I
All
mean,
right, we'll take like two more
I'll
minutes.
okay. The last one I'll mention is our approval automation. So NetSuite has native approvals out of the box. They work fairly well, especially if you have like fairly straightforward small organization, like easy approval rules. Um, we often see like the larger organizations with more complex approvals, more approvers, different thresholds coming to use our solution because they're looking for easily configurable matrices, out of office approvals. So you have backup approvers and so on. So NetSuite's native approvals work really well for, I guess, vanilla out of the box use cases.
More static. Yeah,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
here's your purchase rec, who does it go to if it's this amount? Who does it go to if this is this other amount? And
Yeah.
how many layers of approvals is it? That's about it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So once you want to add complexity to that matrix, that's where our solution comes into play. So it can be more easily designed to fit your business process rather than your business process being designed to
I
fit
see.
NetSuite. I'd say that's the general theme across the board, kind of how we take things the last mile inside of NetSuite.
Yeah, so an example would be, all right, you've got a purchase requisition. It goes to Susan, but Susan has PTO or got too busy and it's been a day. Well, who's the backup person at that same approval level that can do it and get to it faster than Susan because she just was busy or was on PTO? But you need to keep things moving along, keep the processes, and then it can go to the next year. That makes sense to me, how it
Yep.
can be really useful to keep things moving on an organization that has higher velocity and that higher volume of POs and purchase recs that they're dealing with.
Yeah, yeah, especially when you're working with like strategic vendors with there, you may have short payment terms with those vendors. So like if you have discounts from, net 10 discounts, you've got to process these approvals very quickly in order to capture that discount on this bill. So if you're waiting 5 days for Susan to get back into the office and you're paying with a check, well, now it's already too late. You're not going to get that discount.
You're not going to
So
get
you
that
need to have
2% off a 500K invoice or whatever that
yeah,
is.
yeah, exactly. It's like
Yeah.
these types of rules can actually make money for your organization, or at least they can create value very directly for the organization.
hmm Well, thanks for going through all of these AP automations. I know you have more, but this was really cool to go through some of the key ones that we talked about was the vendor creation approval flow, also the vendor bill, extracting that information to get it into NetSuite, accruals so you can do month-end close, and then finally just the approval process for POs and purchase recs. It was really cool to talk about all of those, and it really takes Chartered really takes that next level to take AP automation and the procure to pay process to a level that's much more automated within NetSuite. And that's what I've loved about it. Even in some of the screenshots you shared, you could tell that it's fully embedded within NetSuite so that it just feels like you're working in NetSuite all day long and that you're able to go through all your processes without navigating to a lot of systems. I love that. It's really clean interface. It's actually more embedded within NetSuite, but cleans it up even further, makes it really useful. And I know the building blocks that you're using that I often use on customizations inside of NetSuite. And that's part of the beauty of NetSuite as a whole is you can use these building blocks to build custom applications and products to have them live within NetSuite and interact with that NetSuite data. It's a great way to do architecture And I'm a big fan of what you all have created. So thanks for coming on the podcast. And I would love to have you on another to talk about some of those other automations that we haven't discussed and as the product continues to evolve for even more features.
Yeah, well, definitely. And thank you, Caleb. I enjoyed it. It was a great discussion. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely.